Hello, and welcome to another Issue podcast. I'm Sharis Alia, and this month we explore the theme of addiction. This theme has been a real challenge to our writers, artists, and editors across the board, with a fair few of us finding it difficult to find a grasp on such a complex and layered topic. For our monthly recorded conversation, we sat down with social worker and writer Petra Gimbad, who has previously worked with street youth and sex workers in Kuala Lumpur, and who is now pursuing her master's degree in Yogyakarta. We're very lucky to have Petra bring her experience and wider perspective to the discussion, especially to a topic that I know really intimidated me in its enormity. Petra and I spent a bulk of our conversation discussing addiction in relation to substance abuse, but we also looked at addiction generally, what it meant, how we thought about it, and how we deal with it. We also touched on the subject of choice, of bad habits, of semantics, and of empathy, which I know for me shed new light on some of the dark crevices of addiction I had not really looked at before. I hope something similar or equally as useful occurs for you. We hope you enjoy our 6th issue podcast.
About 6 months before I left for my master's, I realized that my colleagues and I had come to this point where we were decent at what we were doing, but we still lacked a lot of answers on how to actually work with the street youth communities whom we were working with a lot more effectively. And it got to that point where I realized the answers couldn't be found in KL anymore.
Okay.
So that's the reason why I decided, okay, I need to take a year off. I need to do my master's and see whether academics has anything to offer in terms of coming up with a solution, or at least pointing us, towards a certain direction.
I think for now we'll probably go back to your personal experiences, but I would like to start just to talk about addiction in the general sense before we start getting specific.
Yeah.
I would say that you probably have the most experience out of the 3 people in this room in terms of dealing with addiction. And not to say that, we're all clean-cut, good little boys and girls here, but I think it's just in terms of directly seeing the effects of it on the street in people. So I think my first question to you would probably be a little bit general, but please feel free to either ask me questions back or expand, is how would you explain the definition of addiction to someone who's never experienced it?
My view of addiction, I think how do I explain this? I was having a conversation with a good friend who was struggling to understand, well, how is it, that some people who were very close to her, good friends, had started using pot and were making statements like, well, like pot is a lot less harmful compared to alcohol.
Yeah.
We'll keep it kosher here, so I won't talk about what my personal views on that, actually is. And I mean, she actually said, after that, well, it's not like I don't understand. I mean, she was very disapproving, but she also said, well, it's not like I don't understand addiction anyway.
Yeah.
Because food can be an addiction and the rest of it. And it was probably because I had just started my internship in Indonesia, and I was thinking very deeply about some of the children whom I've worked with in Malaysia.
Yeah.
A lot of whom, you talk to them, you beg them, you put them into drug rehab. They come out, clean, all is well, they're reunited with their families.
Yeah.
And then in about 6 months or even less, they're back on the streets,
Oh, wow.
back in the old lifestyle again,
Yeah.
And the person didn't mean to, but what she said actually made me very angry. And I told her, I was like, look, I'm not saying that food can't be an addiction, but you're talking about a very different kind of addiction.
Yeah.
Where it's almost, as if though, so that at the back of your mind that this is not what you should do, it's not logical, it doesn't make you happy in the end, it's not sustainable, it's just something to get you through the day, or something else. But I explained to her, like let's say if you're talking about heroin, the reason why you need methadone, to deal with hardcore heroin cases is because once the shakes come,
the withdrawal.
Yeah, the withdrawal syndrome. Once you get into withdrawal mode, it actually hurts. It's actually quite painful.
Yeah.
I think it's very difficult for all of us to give up certain habits. Yes, And that can actually be a way for us to engage very compassionately with what addiction actually means, rather than from a very hierarchical, and very judgmental point of view. But at the same time as well, we also have to remember that there are different levels of addiction. So there are some levels that we can actually relate to, certain aspects, yes. But I think there are also like certain, like levels or certain aspects of addiction where, unless if you've literally been through the same thing, you can't actually say that, all right, I know what this actually means.
I think that's a really articulate way of putting something that I've been struggling with in terms of, I think the word addicted is used quite carelessly these days to mean something that it might not always necessarily mean. And I feel like what you said about using our personal struggles with giving up bad habits, which is to an extent a layer of addiction, to understand deeper substance addictions that leads to actual physical repercussions. I think, I've struggled to call it addiction when it comes to things like food or something when it's not substances. Is that wrong, do you think?
Well, I attended this healing workshop in New Zealand some time back. And what I discovered was, because I was the youngest person there, I was still in my 20s then. And most of my course mates were actually women in their 40s and 50s. A lot of whom, like have families. And it came out that a couple of them were very worried about their sons who were into substance abuse. So I really like how the facilitator talked about substance use. And she said, well, some of us can be very addicted to perfume. Some of us can be very addicted, to colors. It's like you go out the house, you can't wear a dark color. Like you have to wear something like bright, Or, like you can't, like live without perfume. But I think what was helpful, about the whole thing was, it wasn't that, I'm addicted to, let's say, shopping. Like that was the example that we were talking about before in the interview. But like this was a very specific context where they were worried about addiction, which was happening and impacting them, in a very concrete way. So I think that was quite helpful because even though we are talking about colors and then we are talking about perfume, it took on a different significance because we were relating it like back to the issue of, well, like my sons are using drugs, and then these are potentially hardcore drugs. How do we actually like deal with it? Well, to break, because when you use hardcore drugs, after a while it changes your brain chemistry. When you see how a person behaves, you literally go into physical pain when you're going through heroin drug withdrawal. And I'm not saying that you don't go through a certain amount of mental pain, when you are trying, to break other habits, but the way in which, like we talk about it, I don't think that for this person in particular, if she decides like, all right, I don't want to eat this certain food, like over the next 2-3 hours, I don't think, it's so acute where we'll need to feed her methadone, just so that she can get through the next few hours, you see. So I think, we have to just be aware, that, there are other people who are experiencing addiction, and it's on a totally different level than what we are aware of.
I agree.
But the issue that I have with how a lot of Malaysians actually educate each other, and we're not just talking about persons under the age of 18, even how we conduct public discourse with each other, whether you're talking about people in their 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s and beyond, is that we say, okay, drugs are bad. But when you ask, well, what does that mean? Like, why do you say drugs are bad? Do you know, like, how do you actually unpack that? We can't really talk about why drugs are bad, in a very sophisticated way. So we know some of the reasons why drugs are bad for you, but it's a little bit like sex, I think, like where, we know that, all right, getting pregnant is bad for you, but no one actually like tells you, how easy it is to get pregnant. That kind of thing.
Right.
So I think it's a combination of factors for the youth whom I work with, where one, they knew that drugs were bad for them, but they didn't necessarily know what that meant. Okay, and I think it's also about the social circus within, you mix with, because they were street youth. So it's accepted that, you can use drugs, if you actually like want to. So if you see your friends using them and then they say, well, like this is fine, you can still see them functioning. That's the thing that a lot of people don't realize, you can be addicted to substances and still functions. In fact, a lot of them continue to function because they're using substances. So that's when we start to understand, well, how does it work for street communities where, like using substances is also, a means of survival. The youth whom I work with, like some of them were involved in gang work, meaning that, they did debt collection. Okay. So that's quite dangerous work. Some of them, they push drugs. And because of the area where they lived, where like heroin was quite popular, and ice is gaining quite some popularity actually, like around KL and in other states in Malaysia as well. Like some of them would just use heroin, but some of them would mix the two, because heroin chills you out, and then ice gives you that energy, and that high, like to keep working, that kind of like courage, you see. And then you also have sex workers, who may use substances for whatever reasons, you want to think of. It could be for survival, it could be for business, it could be for their own, like a personal, like comfort. And when you see where they actually live, in the past, for the first few months where we worked with them, you see them sleeping in front of, let's say, KFC or Starbucks here and there, or you have like Honda showrooms that look really spick and span in the daytime, and then 8 o'clock onwards, like everyone, like hangs out there, with their stray cats. I mean, it was like a socializing space. And then when they were driven underground, and when you see, like where they live, I mean, you can understand why they would rather, like sleep in front of KFC, for instance, because like one of the places that my colleagues and I used to go to, like quite often, was this house that was burned down.
Right.
But it still had some parts of their roofs, like still up.
Yeah.
So depending on where you sleep, there's still some shade, from the rain and the elements.
Yeah.
And to live, in those conditions, I mean, can you really wonder why is it, that they actually need substances of some sort?
Okay.
Yeah. So if you're talking about the very extreme reasons, that could be why.
Yeah.
But in terms of addiction in general, I think we could also ask, well, I mean, in KL now, you have a lot of private colleges and universities where, like pot use, is is done quite frequently, and they're not going through quite the same things, but they are going through their own challenges. It's also a social thing.
Yeah.
So at the same time, we shouldn't look at addiction as, it's only something that, let's say, street youth do.
Yeah.
Which I don't think is what you're trying to ask me at all.
But I think there is a danger where when people think addiction, they have an image of a junkie in mind, and that's, to them, it's a habit that's doesn't really exist if you're not living in those extreme conditions. Then they maybe wonder, why would you get so far into it that you can't get out of it?
Well, I would argue that it's not just persons who live in those extreme situations, but just simply people who don't use substances, or who've not been exposed, to persons who actually use substances. You can't even like say now, that a street youth who understand what a matriculation student is going through, and vice versa, like their drug use are two totally different things.
That's very interesting.
And and of course, you have, like let's say university students, who use it on a recreational level.
Yeah.
And they aren't necessarily addicted. It's like something that we do, when we're in a social setting or when we're alone, to de-stress. Some would consider themselves addicted. Some, would consider themselves not, depending on why they take it, and how often.
We were speaking earlier about the social aspect of drug use. And I think when we say that, we go to, or maybe a majority of our listeners, or you just kind of flash to the party scene of girls who don't know where the pot comes from, but is passing around the joint or whatever.
The guys as well.
Yeah, of course.
No idea. Don't know where's Kampung Baru.
Yeah, but then also we were saying how the street youth, there's all these non-desirable conditions that they're living in, but they could still use it recreationally and for fun and in a social setting. And you were saying something about the sharing of needles, of it being social. Could you...
From what I saw, but this is just my perception,
of course.
When I was working with street youth was, I mean, yes, you use heroin for pleasure, but you also use it, like because it gives you, like you get very antsy, when you have to go out to work. I mean, it's sex work, on the street, in very violent, like very difficult conditions. There's always, like the chance of you being picked up by the police, and locked up. And if they arrest you and they decide, to bring you, to, like one of their main, prison centers, then you are in without bail for 2 weeks. So it's a very frightening situation to actually be in. So it's understandable, therefore why they turn to heroin, in order to just like chill them out, so that they can actually work for the night. I was talking to my colleagues in Indonesia about heroin use. And why is it, like we share needles, and we were talking about this researcher called Elizabeth Pisani, who does research on HIV/AIDS mainly in Indonesia. So she came out with a very interesting TED talk, and if listeners, if you've not watched Elizabeth Pisani on TED.com, please look her up. Very, very entertaining. She talks about sex and drugs. She talked about why is it that junkies like share needles.
Yeah.
And the context where she was doing her research, it was very common sense, because if you for number one, you really, really don't care, when you're, at that point, whether a shared needle or not. But also the reason why, you share a needle rather than everyone carrying their own needle is because if the police picks you up and you happen to be carrying a needle, you get into trouble.
Yeah.
And when you think about, the risk factor, it's a lot more likely that the police will pick you up and find you with a needle tonight than the likelihood of you actually, getting HIV, let's say, by passing around a needle tonight. So when you're talking
comparison of risks.
Yeah, so it actually becomes very logical and common sense. And she also talks about drug use in prisons.
Yeah.
And she said, well, if there's one place where you want to get high, it's actually in prison, which kind of made me think again, the street youth who my colleagues and I work with in KL, where if you actually see where these youths live, where they literally sleep on sampah sarap, why wouldn't you want to get high? I'm not saying that, okay, it's the perfect solution, but you can at least empathize with that. You can understand, all right, this is what they do, because this is what they do to make it easier for themselves.
Yeah.
Because it's also a very social activity. Like when we were talking about needles, when I was talking to my friend in Indonesia about that Elizabeth Pisani talk.
Yeah.
He said, well, it's not just about you share a needle because you don't want to be picked up by the cops and put into prison, that night. And, you know, obviously, if something happens to you in prison, if you're raped or whatever by someone, who, has a disease, well, you don't want to put up that sort of violence.
Yeah.
But he said, it's also, a way, of bonding, as a social group, where you share a needle.
Yeah.
So, so that was very insightful for me as well.
I think sometimes, I'm not sure whether this is a personal thing for me or whether it's attitudes that I've encountered with my friends or, when I have encountered the topic of addiction, not even just real addiction, but just the topic. But it almost feels like every time, even right now when I'm asking you questions, I feel like what I'm really asking is how do we fix this? Which is, I think, not a useful or a question that anybody can answer, but it almost feels like for a person that doesn't work with street youth or doesn't encounter addiction on a regular basis, it almost feels like it's this problem and it's very abstract. And trying to figure out whether people are predisposed to drugs or people are predisposed to being an addict or whatever is, the ultimate question is how do we fix that so that there are no more addicts? So it's, I don't know, this is a statement more so than a question, but I don't know if you've got a response to that. I just wonder if that's an attitude that you come across a lot or whether it's helpful, unhelpful, or misguided.
Well, what I've come to think is, how do you fix the human condition? Don't even talk about drugs. How do you fix the human condition?
Yeah.
What does it actually mean, to be a human being? And I think, if we can embrace, that human beings are messy, we've got a lot of goodness in us, but we are also apt to make mistakes, and there are certain things that will look like mistakes but actually make, a lot of sense. It would be probably, a lot easier for us to actually start to engage, with the persons, who we want to fix. Okay, and I say this with inverted commas,
yes.
Fix. That's one. And I was having a conversation last year, with a friend, who uses different substances, recreationally. And he said something interesting, he said, well, what a lot of people I don't understand is certain drugs. I think we were talking about LSD at the time. A lot of drugs, which we now, think, this is something, that drug addicts use. Were actually, were actually created by pharmaceutical companies, for persons, who were ill. And he was like, well, you think about it, who created these, in the first place? You're talking about, sanctioned, approved, medical labs, that actually came up with these drugs. And then once you realize that, then it makes it even more interesting. It's how is it that the drugs that you're selling, in one context is so acceptable, and then the drugs that you're selling in another context, are not? One story, a pal of mine was telling me how his friend, who managed to get over his heroin addiction, okay, after a lot of struggle, he got into an accident,
Yeah.
and he went in, and I was like, so how's the guy? Like, is he okay? He's like, oh, of course he's happy. And I was like, why? Then it's like, well, I mean, he was in so much pain because of the addiction that, they gave him free drugs, so he said like, well, it's great,
Yeah.
because, I get my free fix. So it's like, well, like here he is, like trying, to get off the habit,
Yeah.
and has been off it, for quite a while.
And
you
then-
put him in hospital, for understandable reasons. Yeah, they gave you painkillers,
Yeah.
but I mean, I think it's a really interesting way, to reflect then, well, what do we mean by drug use? Like who actually dispenses it? Who's making money, like off it? Like why is it accepted in one sector and not another, you see?
Yeah, I think that's actually very interesting in terms of what substances we deem acceptable and what, in the context of drug use, suddenly become like an ultimate evil, because things like morphine are used in medical contexts, and prescription pills, which you can obviously become addicted to, Ritalin and Adderall and all those things for, college students or whatever. And it's interesting once you start going into street drugs, which are, it's almost kind of a classist thing. Like if you've got a college student addicted to marijuana, and I've had a few stories in uni where I didn't even know if this was possible, whether it was a rumor, but like a guy literally went to hospital because he smoked too much pot and addled his brain and all that stuff.
I know that it's possible to smoke so much pot that you become very, very paranoid.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And to the point where I think you need to be protected against yourself. And
well, I've not met anyone directly, who's actually like had it that bad.
Yeah.
But I mean, I don't know enough, about brain chemistry and all that, But
either.
I think there is something to be said that, well, if you actually, like take too much, it does actually like alter, like the physiological, like a biological makeup, of your brain.
But it just feels like there's this weird line that maybe is being put between that person and a person who is addicted to heroin on the streets and doesn't have a home or is sharing needles. And obviously there are differences, and obviously there are different repercussions and possible consequences, but it's that I think being addicted to a substance is not as complicated as some people maybe think it is. Like before you take that first hit of whatever, in whatever context you're in, I don't think a lot of people think about, oh, five months from now I'm going to be addicted to this thing.
Yeah.
So it's, why is it a series of little choices, do you think, of like every time you do it it's another concession, or is choice not even do you think it's not even present in the decisions that are made by?
I think it depends on what you're taking and when you're taking it, in your life. Because,
Okay.
I mean, I've had friends as well, who did heroin like once, twice. No problem, they're like, all right, I tried it, wasn't interested, And then you have people, like who, like they do it, and it's like you can't stop thinking, about
Yeah.
it. So again, going back to the fact that we are human beings who are non-homogeneous.
Yeah.
I think, like we are different, to a large degree physiologically.
Yeah.
It also depends on where you are at that point of time, in your life. Like if I were to drink, when I'm happy, I could probably like just take it or leave it,
Yeah.
But if I were to drink, when I'm very sad, very depressed, like really angry,
It could become a
then the
crutch.
the sort of like drinking that could like happen that night, would be very different,
Yeah,
And if
yeah.
I do it again and again, obviously it becomes a habit,
Yeah.
go on too long, it becomes an addiction.
It's unfortunate that we have to stop here, but that's all the time we have for this month's podcast. Thank you to Petra for joining us on the discussion. Our magazine this month is chock full of other thoughtful, exciting, and provocative explorations on addiction. This month's theme might have been our hardest yet, but the results we think have been breathtaking. We do hope you take a chance to read through all of this month's pieces. Remember to like us on Facebook at facebook.com/issuemag and follow us on Twitter at twitter.com/issuemag. Thanks again. I'm Sharis Alia, and we'll see you here again next month for issue number 7, Theme and Meaning.